either sadhus, or they were wily rajas, or they were murdering people, and, or there was, of course, the book I loved, but of course it had nothing to do with my life. There was Kim, which I loved. There was Kim, and there was the Jungle Book. But where were my world in this? Nowhere. And that made me very aware at a very young age of an need for an alternative voice. And when I came back to England, to Pakistan, age 19, I didn't know Pakistan then. So then I started to read Ahmad Ali, and these are the people we need to look out for. Ahmad Ali. I started to read Zulfikar Ghaus, and I started Mumtaz Shahnawaz. What happened then was that a lot of this writing belonged to an earlier era. It was a little old-fashioned. And the new writing, the new voice, that was the kind of voice that was available in contemporary England, starts in Pakistan, it starts with Zulfikar Ghaus. He was a diaspora writer, and it starts with poetry. It starts with Tawfiq Rafat, Kalim Umar, Salman. Salman's one of our leading poets, Adrian Hussain. They started bringing in a new voice. And in order to understand Pakistani literature in English, you have to look at this poetry. We don't. We look, nowadays, we have started focusing too much on fiction, which is there, but there's still some very good poetry being written. I hope that answers that.
Yes, that answers that, and I'm very happy for your compliment to poetry in English. Poetry tends to be the unfortunate, undernourished, underregarded twin of prose, more often than not, at least as far as Pakistani poets writing in English is concerned. Okay, but I'm going to come back to my question of origins to this extent that even in prose, right, I agree with you that Zulfikar Ghaus is probably the guru, if you like, of those of us who chose to write poetry in English. But when you come to prose, again, one has many fine prose writers in an older idiom.
Yes.
As you correctly said about poetry. The idiom does begin to change when? When would you say? Bapsi Sidhwa or earlier?
No, it changes with Ghaus, actually. It's with Ghaus, who has wrote the first contemporary Pakistani English poems, first to be published. He published his first full-length collection in 1964. He co-wrote the first contemporary collection of short stories, which he co-wrote with B.S. Johnson. That was about 1965. 1967, he wrote The Murder of Aziz Khan, his novel, for which he is still best known, about rural Punjab, about the power struggle between an industrialist and a traditional farmer in rural. So it begins with Ghaus, actually, and then you get Bapsi coming about 10 years later, actually. But there are two things that happen here. One is the new voice starts emerging. In Pakistan, we are still, meanwhile, although you've got poets like Rafat and Salman and Adrian, they're writing in English, they're being broadcast on the radio. In the 70s, they were broadcast on the radio. There was a lot of impetus on Pakistani English poetry at the time, but there was still this entire debate about should Pakistanis be writing in English and shouldn't they be really writing in Urdu, but this without any real thought to the contradiction in the fact that you had an English language press, you had English language memoirs. All these things were considered all right, but somehow writing creatively, you were supposed to write in your own tongue, and there was this big debate. So there were two or three things that happened, and it's also linked both to Bapsi and to the poetry. One was that a new voice started to emerge, full stop. You know, you get new talent coming up. The other thing was that in Western countries, they started looking at English literature in a different way. In the Old days, they just looked, English literature was just English or American writing. After the war, after the Second World War, they realized that there was some rather good writing coming from countries which had been colonized. Countries like India, Pakistan, Nigeria. So they started a new literary dialogue which started looking for these writers, and the British publishers started publishing them. And that also gave a new impetus. After Babsi, you had Sara Soleri's creative memoirs, you had Adam Zaminzad, who's just passed away recently. Very few people know about him. Those books didn't come here for a long time. And it just started on a snowball effect.
Sorry to interrupt, I didn't know Adam Zaminzad had passed away.
Yes, sadly about a month ago, 2 months ago.
That is sad.
He was a very good
writer.
writer.
Pardon, interrupted.
No, that's all right. He was a very good writer. And you see, the other thing is the internet, the satellite media and internet age. When books by people of Pakistani origin were published in England, like Adam Zaminzad was, we didn't know about them. I mean, sometimes you wrote an article or two. If you write, as I've found, because my background is journalism, of course, when I was writing reviews or was writing interviews, actually those books were not available in our market, so they sort of glossed over the readership. And with the advent of internet, the satellite media, we started getting an access to that literature, to that literary dialogue, and that in turn affected the book trade, and the booksellers started looking out for these books. One of the things I'd like to say is that, you know, there's this belief that the Pakistani English literature is taken off because of 9/11. Well, I know some of them write about 9/11, a lot of them don't. What has happened is there has been the growth, two things. One is the growth of talent, which coincided, it begins in the late 90s. And the other thing is the satellite media, the access to information about these books, the access to what Western publishers are publishing, and also the access now, which was not available before, to Indian publishing.
I'm happy you mentioned that about 9/11. That is a common belief that Pakistani novels only took off after 9/11. No, that's not true. It's quite possible that more people around the world have heard of Pakistan in those negative that negative sense after those events. But I don't think that influences the work of artists in any serious manner. Maybe there are odd opportunists here or there. And yes, I've come across an Indian author who certainly exploited 9/11 in English. And I'm not going to go into the details, so it was terrible.
Well, I mean, it's something that you respond to. I mean, it's happened in your midst. So you respond to it. It's not necessarily an exploitation. It's an answer, or it's an engagement, because it affected so many people.
Exactly. And so many American authors have written it, so why not? That's, I think, not the most important thing. No, the more important thing to me is another question which I'd like you to comment on, Melissa. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, when we had been reading Tawfiq Rafat, Maki Qureshi, Kaleem Omar, and Khosrow Fikar Khos, and people like, well, Adrian, Daud Kamal, Khuda Bakshi, myself, and others, कि हम भी लिख रहे थे शायरी, हम लिखने लग गए थे काफ़ी, और उस पर चर्चा भी काफ़ी हुआ था उस ज़माने में. I remember giving TV interviews, I remember writing things for the newspapers, being interviewed for the newspapers, and so on. ये सब कुछ मुझे याद है. उसके बाद से लगा कि शायद अंग्रेजी में पाकिस्तान में कम हो गए हैं, यानी कि वो चर्चा एक लिहाज से ख़त्म हो गया. मगर दूसरी तरफ नसर का चर्चा बढ़ गया. A lot of very fine novelists came to the fore, and I think of well, of course, Babsi Sidwa, Sara Soleri, Kamla Shamsi, your daughter, Adam Zaminzad, and so many others who then emerged. Mohsen Hamid, sorry, let me mention perhaps another very fine writer, Hussain Naqvi, and so on. lot of very fine fiction writers who emerged at about that time, shortly thereafter. And since then, one's found as poetry as the poor twin being eclipsed by fiction, the major brother. And now we hear a lot about Pakistani fiction writers, but very little about Pakistani poetry writers in English. Your comment?
Oh, well, there are two things here. Actually, we have to go back into history. That there was that big impetus to English in the 70s, English language writing, and at that time, what was being written here was poetry. It was not, the prose was still, there was a lot of prose. If you read Tariq Rahman's History of Pakistani Literature in English, he's covered, in 1990, he's covered a wide range of books, a lot of them very archaic or inadequate, but the struggle to find that voice was there. But what took off was poetry. And it had the support of the government, and that in the 70s, they were not inimical to the government. English was, was a language of, it still is a language of government, and it gave you access to the outside world. In 1980, the Zia regime, of course, wanted to do away with English to start off with. There were a lot always with these things. It's never one thing. One of the things that happened in the late 70s, there was actually a crisis in the publishing industry, and the price of paper and ink went up. So that affected the outlets, that affected publishing. It's all, it's one thing to do with appreciation, and the other thing is a writer has to be published. And if you are not available, if a publisher is not available, it is very difficult. And this thing about poetry not finding proper publishing continues to this day. I mean, you do get people who self-publish, but there are a lot of writers writing very good work, and they have not been published. And this carries on. I mean, when you think that in the 70s, people like Marquis and Adrian and Salman were considered major leading poets, and yet they were not published until 1997 in a full-length volume. That's 13 years. That's an awful long time for anybody. What has happened is that I think it is a universal truth, mind you, that, except I think possibly in Urdu where Shari is so big, but I mean, for example, in the English-speaking world, the fiction writers do get more publicity, I think. I think many more people many more people read fiction and its different dimensions than they read poetry. Poetry is a specialized interest. It is a different, so I think that with the growth of fiction, I think that factor is also there. The other factor is publishing. But you do have poets over here. I've just received a book, that's Salman Pirzada. I've just read a book by a writer in Lahore called Rizwan Akhtar. There's Kaila Pasha also in Lahore, who's published a collection. It was published in India. There's Ilona Yusuf. So there's Mavish. I mean, now you've also got literary journals coming out. There's one called Alif, which Ilona and Mavish Amin are doing. I think the Athar Tahir is doing one. Now all these what you need is an outlet for poetry once you get and a published outlet. If you have a small poetry reading, that only reaches a few people, but once it's published, it goes into the classroom. So you really need this publishing opportunity. On the other hand, in the diaspora, writers of Pakistani origin have been doing extremely well, but for some odd reason they're not known here. You've got Muniza Alvi, who has written about 6 collections. She has been up for the T.S. Eliot Prize. She's won several prizes. Her last collection, which blew me away, was called At the Time of Partition. It is the story of her grandmother, a widowed grandmother, who fled from, I think, Jalandhar to Lahore with her children, and one of her children was handicapped. And en route, that handicapped child got lost. And this this agony, and in the way she puts it is so beautiful. And that is a book. I mean, it's not just a book that is about diaspora writing or identity. It is a book that is very much ours, and we should claim it. Then you have Imtiaz Dharkar. She grew up in England also, like Maniza, and she married an Indian for a while, but her family belongs to Lahore, and she writes beautiful poems about Anarkali. And not only that, it is hardly known in Pakistan that last year Imtiaz Dharkar was awarded the Queen's Medal for Poetry. She is the first South Asian writer to have been awarded this medal, which has gone to poets like Robert Graves and Fleur Adcock, and some really big names. And Imtiaz Dharkar is in that galaxy, and we hardly know about it. So I'm not quite sure why this has happened. Again, I think it's access of books, access of poetry.
There is, of course, the other frequent accusation one has that those of us who write in English are from an elite, writing for an elite, writing about an elite. Whether we are writing prose or poetry, as I said, from an elite, by an elite, for an elite, and about an elite. Would you like to comment on that? It's not.
Yes, well, this is another subject we talk a lot about. Well, there are two or three things here. For one thing, it is a fact that English is a language limited to a certain cadre of people. It's not as elite as it was perhaps in the pre-colonial era where they just wanted, but it is a language in our country. And of course India and the whole South Asia, which is restricted to a certain number of people. And therefore those who use it are the products of a certain school where this has become their strongest language. That is one argument. But if you can't just take English in isolation. It is a much wider language. And again, we come back to that point I made about the Jungle Book and Kim. You are writing from the margins of English literature. Whether you are rich, whether you are poor, it doesn't matter who you are. When you write from this part of the world in English, you are providing a narrative that is completely different to the narratives of English literature. Your voice has to be heard. Otherwise, we're down to the moonstone, the sadhus and the yogis and the,
Waterists.
The what?
Waterists.
Oh, nowadays, of course, it's the terrorists. I'm still stuck on the yogis and the sadhus. Otherwise, there's that. And this voice is important because it is not only being heard here, and within the schools where, mind you, you are studying that English literature. That same English literature about sadhus and yogis and terrorists is also being looked at here. And whether you are elitist or not, you are providing an alternative perspective to that. The other thing that has been completely or almost disregarded is the fact that actually it is not elitist anymore, because a lot of the writings by writers of Pakistani origin is coming from the diaspora. And those writers are using English because it is the language in which they function. It's the language of England, it's the language of America. And they write about experiences that a lot of these writers belong to working class communities. They have grown up in the working class communities of Britain, and they have suffered indignities, or they have struggled through conflicts that are very different to what we imagine an elite Indian Pakistani should go through. I mean, you might be marginalized in those countries, but it is very different to being growing up in a kind of desi ghetto in Britain. And one of the things I have found, which I found a little distressing, is because English here is a language of a certain type of people. They tend to think this working class literature, which is being produced in England, they tend to think, oh, he's just confirming all the awful prejudices the English have about us. you know, they don't perceive themselves as having unlettered parents or so on, which these boys write about, boys and men and women. They write about the conflicts of that community. Our closed community was surrounded by a hostile community, and how they break through. And when they break through, then, well, Nadeem Aslam's Maps for Lost Lovers has the story of his mother. Very simple. She's very religious, and the more hostile, she becomes more and more religious, but she can't cope with the fact that her son has become an artist. To her, it is just inexplicable. You know, so these situations are very real situations in the diaspora, and these voices, which are Pakistani voices, are expressing them.
I think it's also worth mentioning that this year's Booker Prize list, long list, had 2 Pakistani writers on it, Mohsin Hamid and your daughter Kamla Shamsi. Kamla's novel, Home Fire, for those who've read it, is very much also located within the working class community of England.
Yes,
where it is. And this particular, the Muslim working class community, which is amenable to overtures from the extremists around the world. That was, I think, one. And the other main character is a Pakistani Muslim immigrant to England who rises to become a minister in the British government. And it's quite a remarkable work worth reading. I'm not going to ask you to comment on it because...
Thank goodness for that. I mean, I was about to say, I don't comment, I'm just a mother.
I know you can't. I
don't comment on Kamla's work, and I get my head chopped off anyway.
I'm commenting, and along with one other thing, that it's not, okay, we know these, I am going to add this, we know these big names, and they are now big names, Kamla Shamsi, Mohsin Hamid, Nadeem Aslam, and so on. Recently I've been reading a number of books from debut Pakistani writers written in English, a lot of them out of Lahore, and I'm quite surprised, personally very delighted at the standard of writing that is emerging, the imagination, the originality, the quality of writing. Yes, there are defects that young writers may have, but I'm not saying that patronizingly, but that will always be there. And of course there are young poets around everywhere, so I have a lot of hope. Sorry, that was my comment, endorsing yours, Manisa. Let me just make a little more mention of this book. What compelled you to write it? I mean, it's so detailed, it's so complete, it's so, how would I say, it's an enormous work. And those of you who want to read it, please read it, because you can dip into it and dip into different parts, because it's a very, very fine survey of the whole of Pakistani literature written in English, whether prose, whether poetry, whether drama. That's also covered. So can I ask you finally to comment on that, because then I think we have through the open for questions.
What made me write it was actually because I realized that I had been engaged with this literature for a rather long time. You know, again, as I said, because as my awareness as a child, then coming back here, and the poets were my friends, and I used to sit up, before I started writing for the newspapers, the poets were my friends. I used to sit around at Mixed Voices, which Adrian Hussain had started. I knew Kaleem Umar was a friend of mine. And then I started writing for Dawn, and my editor discovered I loved books. So he dispatched me to do literary interviews. I interviewed Hanif Qureshi when he was all of 28 on his first trip to Pakistan, and I realized that I had been following this and I had been recording it for a large number of years, and there hadn't been a comprehensive work covering Pakistani English literature since Tariq Rahman's book in 1990. Although there's been a lot of very valuable work done by Alamgir Hashmi in his books. You know, he's done some excellent anthologies, and his critical writings in the academic journals. So it was really, I wanted to follow up. I mean, I have to say, Alamgir Hashmi and Tariq Rahman were the two Pakistani critics that I wanted to develop on their work. What actually happened was I thought it was taking me 2-3 years, you know, and I thought, but when I started researching it, I thought, oh goodness, there are all sorts of people I hadn't heard of. And so I went and I started finding critical work. And then the other thing that happened was that from the time I started writing this book, all the Pakistani writers became terribly prolific, and they kept churning. And each time there's someone turned out a new book, my heart would sink, and I think, oh God, another book to write about. And finally, a friend of mine said, look, you have got to have a cut-off date. You're mad. You'll never finish this book. So I cut it off on 2011. The idea being, from its development in Pakistan to the first decade of the new millennium, and I did a quick sort of summary of the next 2 or 3 years, and I thought someone can take it up from there, because between 1947 to 2011, this literature has undergone a sea change, and it's now on the brink. You know, it's now taking off into something really big, I think.
Okay, I think we're running close on time now. Just want to add one little sentence, a couple of sentences, which is only that, yes, you're absolutely right, it's on the brink. Apart from the prose writers, I also know of a number of young poetry writers. I've talked about the debut writers who have been coming, that have surprised me that there are so many,
Yes,
and in English. So really, English writing in Pakistan and by Pakistanis and about Pakistan is on, I think, a positive thing. And I think old fogies like myself have to wake up and start writing again. So having said that, let me ask anybody in the house if they want to, for any questions. Please, over there.
Good afternoon. My question is, as you mentioned that during your course of study when you were writing this book on English literature in Pakistan, there were many names which we didn't know even existed because we never had seen their work. What challenge do you see, and what's the solution of how to promote English literature in the youngsters? Right? Do you think that happening? And what remedy or what course of action would you recommend for that? Thank you.
Well, I think one of the changes it has started to go into schools. I think that's an important aspect of it. It's only when you treat it, as long as you treat it as, oh, it's just because of 9/11, or they write in English because they make more money, which is not actually true. But I mean, if it starts getting into the classroom, I remember my own daughters, when they were about 16 or so, the O-level syllabus introduced The House of Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul into the curriculum. And I remember their response to those books, how excited they were. And I think there was my daughter's called Saman. There was a Saman tree in that book. Oh, they were so excited. Oh, your name is in the book. That kind of thing. So I think if it goes into, parents, of course, and there's a lot of literature actually that is quite suitable for young people. You need to do a little bit of weeding out. But, one thing is the curriculum. The other thing is the accessibility to books. The other thing is, of course, literature festivals like this. I think it's just wonderful and a lot of young people will come. And the other thing that has also been started happening is that a lot of the writers, even when they live abroad, when they come to Karachi or Lahore, anywhere, they get roped in by the schools. I see this with my own daughter. Where are you going? I'm going to such and such. She never tells me, of course, but suddenly I find she's going off to some school, and I know Uzma Aslam Khan goes, and I know Mohsin, and sometimes they even conduct writing courses there. So I think that's the way and you don't always have to have the terribly well known. Even someone who has written a good book, they can go and talk to students.
This is Wasim Hassan from University of St. Jamshoro. First of all, thank you very much for coming to Hyderabad and for this great talk.
It was a great pleasure.
And my question to you is that do you see that in the Pakistani literature itself, among these writers, there are so many writers nowadays writing, in Pakistan or diaspora. Do you see any distinction, or there are some writers like Mohsin Ahmed, Kamila Shamsi, or Babsi Sidba, those who write about politics, both those who write about 9/11, who they have a greater exposure and greater fame in comparison to some of others who belong to Karachi. They stay in Karachi, like Uzma Aslam Khan, Beena Shah. They are also such a marvelous writers. But I see there is something like they don't get their due share of fame and privilege like those. And secondly, please comment that whether, as we all see, as you talked about, that Pakistani English literature is more dominated by politics. So do you think it's at the cost of aesthetics of literature? And if it was not so political, like this Afghanistan scenario, 9/11, and this war on terror, so maybe it should have been, it might have been more diverse, like Indian literature. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know whether I think Beena Shah's, her Season for Martyrs, I think it's done very well. I think it's very highly regarded. It's a very good book. And Uzma also lives, I don't think where you live matters very much anymore. Uzma actually lives in America. She keeps coming to Pakistan. Well, Mohsin lives actually in Lahore. And Muhammad Hanif lives in Karachi, but everybody seems to travel. That's why one of the reasons why I don't make these distinctions between resident and non-resident writing anymore, because, and some of them have been educated abroad, and some, or between two of them, so I don't think that's a distinction. I don't know why some. I've lost the thread now. I've lost the second half of your question, which was politics. Oh, politics. Yeah. No. I think what you say is this term. It's not about resident, non-resident. I think political writing is given more attention. I think these are certain subjects that the West is interested in. One of them is 9/11, all that. I think that West, and you'll get a lot of critical writing on political books, on books which address the issues that interest the West. But actually, you've got a lot of Pakistani English literature that is not political. In that sense, I mean, you've got Musharraf Ali Farooqi's books. There's Clay and Dust, about an courtesan and a wrestler and the changing times after partition. And Musharraf Ali Farooqi doesn't engage in these things. Danyal Moinuddin, it is political in a sense, but not that kind of Western politics. Danyal Moinuddin, he's done extremely well. Amir Hussain is another one. He writes some political stories and not others. So I think there is a much greater range of non-political work than actually most of us know, because it doesn't get the same kind of publicity, but it is there and it engages. And I think even a lot of the political work, and this is terribly bad, I think it does engage with aesthetics. I mean the good work, the literary craft, I think, the politics is woven into the literary craft. I don't think if it's a really good book, the politics stands on top. And if it does, it's not a good book.
May I just add 2 sentences to what you said?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with writing about politics at all. I don't. But there's nothing wrong with doing so. As Foucault said, politics is everywhere. Power drips from everything. And politics is about power. Yes, and some very big things have happened in the last 10, 20, 30 years. They will affect our consciousness and our writings. They're bound to affect around the world. So I don't think anything is wrong with that, but something has to work first as a piece of art, whether it is about politics or not about politics. There has been great writing by fascists, and which we still acknowledge as great writing, even those of us who, like myself, belong to the left. We still acknowledge that as great writing. Ezra Pound was a fascist. William Butler Yeats was a fascist. This is very great writing. And it doesn't matter. What matters is good writing.
Well, actually, Tawfiq Rafat translating Bulle Shah in the 1980s was a strongly political act.
Yes.
He was asserting mysticism against the kind of sort of monolithic preachings of Zia al-Haq. He said, this is our culture. It was a very political act, although it's not as straightforward.
In a sense,
yes,
all writing. In a sense, all writing is a defiance of power.
This is Amanullah Hassan from Institute of English Language and Literature, University of Sindh. It's a pleasure and honor to have you here in Hyderabad. And then first of all, I want to comment on your daughter's work, which is cartography, and her book Cartography. This book has remained on my background, cell phone's background for last 3 years. I was unable to get it, but luckily I got one of its copy at last HLF. So, then amazing thing of this book is with me that I will not able to finish it yet. Every time I reach its middle, I go back to the first page and read it, and I've been reading it and enjoying it, but I have not been able to finish it yet. Hopefully this year I'll be able to make it. And then my question, in yesterday's sessions there was talk on this thing, that they were saying that our writers, we can see clear reflection of our culture, these fields and this background in their writings. And the speakers, I think they considered it something wrong. They said that our writers, especially from Sindh, their English writings are kind of immature. There's not much maturity found in those writings. Do you agree with this comment, and that the reflection that is obvious in their writings, is it something not good for writing? Thank you.
I've actually never really perceived that when you're writing in English it's necessarily immature. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure in what context it's being looked at, or how it. I mean, I think certainly we should be aware that English language writing is the youngest of our literatures, and as far as contemporary voice is concerned, it's barely 40 years old. So it's going a long way to go. But I don't actually see this problem. I don't see this problem of immaturity at all. And there are a lot of problems in, not problems, when you write in English about any culture that is not English, about Pakistani or Indian culture, you have to work out a very difficult strategy to get that culture into English. How do you get those nuances? How do you get the different accents? And it is something that, it is an ongoing problem that all South Asian English writers continue to tackle. Like you get this kind of voice. I mean, Salman Rushdie made that breakthrough. He introduced what they call bazaar English. He melded some Desi words and Angrezi words, and that opened the pathway for a lot of people. But Babsi also did that in Ice Candy Man, where she used, the sort of hybrid language. And then you get people like Amir Hussain, who read translations, and he said, how do they get it right in translation? How do you translate? How do I get a voice that's like a translation that doesn't sound like a translation? And so there are all these different, but I think they're doing okay. I don't think it's immature, but I think they have a lot of challenges, and they continue to meet them.
I would add Muhammad Hanif in the Alice Bhatti book. It's very much street language he's using of Karachi.
Yes,
bit of Urdu, bit of English, bit of Baluchi, Does that answer your question?
It did, but they at the last time, they were, considering that we should not be, carrying our own culture in those writings.
We should not be, I'm sorry, we should not be?
We should not be, carrying the things of our own culture. Means their writing should not be, always depicting our culture, the scenario or our context of, our land. It is something I personally did not agree, because to me, writing was like depicting our. It was to be constructed in our own context. So there's nothing wrong. But I wanted to comment on from your side
That you shouldn't depict your own culture in English. No, I don't see why you can't. I mean, I think you should try if it matters to you. If that's, with a writer, I mean, it's very difficult. It's what impels a writer. What do you want to write about? What impels a story? What impels your poetry? Sometimes it's an image. A lot of writers will tell you it's not a message. Sometimes it's just an image. Sometimes something they see. And if that image or what you see is from within your culture, then why should you deny it?
In any case, culture is not a geographically bound or historically bound thing. It evolves and changes every moment, as indeed does any living thing, all the time.
This is Mohammad Zaid from Economics Department, University of Sindh. My question is that I need your comment that it is said that in order to translate any piece of work, we don't convey the real message of a writer. For example, someone is translating a book from Urdu into English. You don't really convey the message that really a writer wants to say in Urdu. And
Yes, well, that's quite an interesting point. A lot of people, as a result of this, a lot of people say that that you don't get it right in Urdu, you don't get it, and the original language is better, and so you should learn the original language. That's all right. I mean, some of us cannot learn a lot of languages. Does that mean that we can't? I mean, well, let me take War and Peace. War and Peace is a book that I love. Does that actually mean that we can't read or shouldn't read War and Peace because we don't know Russian? And to add to that story, I would mention my linguist uncle earlier. He did know Russian, and his comment was, I have read War and Peace in Russian, and I don't want to read another novel. That's the ultimate. All this translation is rubbish, which is all very well. But does that mean I shouldn't have read War and Peace? Just because he can read it in Russian. So this is the thing. We must try and translate. And the number of translators are growing, and we must try and translate our languages. And I know there are challenges, and I'm pretty sure that 9 times out of 10 you do not get the voice of the original. But then it would deny us so many literatures. We would not be able to read Cables, we wouldn't be able to read Tolstoy, we wouldn't be able to read anybody. It would be terrible. And reading these books in translations, by the way, a lot of writers read in translations, and those books influence their work in their own languages. So I think whether there's a problem or not, it's still a project that should be tackled.
Let me just remind you that Shakespeare has been translated into every language of the world. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky have all been translated in many languages.
But he's probably better in English,
Yes, Faz has been translated into many languages.
Yeah.
And Neruda, of course, has been translated from every language of the world, and so on and so forth. Marquez, I think, has been translated into most languages.
But we wouldn't be able to read any of them, you see. We can't learn all the languages. This is true. I mean, of our own languages, I think we should make a thing, but...
I think ये बात बिल्कुल समझ आती है कि you can't. It's not easy to translate. क्योंकि पूरी मतलब एक तहजीब आ रही है उस तर्जुमे के पीछे, उस ज़ुबान के पीछे. So that's hard to translate. I agree, but not impossible. And it has been. Yes, there are good translations and bad translations, but it has been done all the time ever since there has been literature, and inshallah will continue to be done.
I must tell you, just to diversify slightly, I was very fascinated to read Tawfiq Rafat's introduction. I think it was either to his translation of Bulleh Shah or the Qadariyar Puran Bhagat. He was talking about the challenges of translating an oral literary form into English. And I came across, by chance, Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf from the Old Anglo-Saxon. And Seamus Heaney writes about the challenges of translating an oral tradition of Anglo-Saxon English. And it was extraordinary because the things he said were so similar to what Tawfiq Rafat had said, and although they had no